And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Tonight, let's call this part 27 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, I want to talk about Mussolini's destiny. What was his destiny? And I think for a lot of people, they look at the end of the war, the ill effect, some of the bad decisions, the military defeat that Italy suffered. And at the end of the day, his destiny, as history records it, as most people understand it, on this basic sort of, colloquial level, is that, well, his decision to take Italy into war was doomed for Italy and ultimately for himself. And after being assassinated by communist partisans on the side of the road, somewhere, I believe it was near Lake Garda. And in essence, everything is history since then. And whatever we may think of this historical figure, he made his choices and suffered the consequences for his choices. When you look at something like the Webster's Dictionary, it defines destiny as a predetermined course of events, often held to be an irresistible power or agency. Other definitions will say that the inevitable or necessary fate to which a particular person or thing is destined, one's lot in life, and a predestined, or excuse me, a predetermined course of events considered as something beyond human power or control, the power or agency thought to predetermine events. See, this is interesting to me because in the end, we can make a predetermination on Mussolini's destiny that he made his choices and this is what his destiny was. I think that's a fair argument to a certain degree. I think we can all acknowledge that Mussolini, being a very nuanced character in history, at the end met his fate, met his destiny because of the choices and the circumstances he found himself under. But see, I've always believed that life is about choices and the choices that we make, and the choices oftentimes that we don't make that can determine where we go in life. And our destiny, is it predetermined? I'm not sure about that. I think choices are everything. I think, as Catholics, we believe in free will, and the free will to make these choices will have an effect of where we go with our lives and our futures, and ultimately will be, um, will be part of that destiny we want to talk about. Now, for Mussolini, who was a very superstitious kind of a guy, um, Raquel in her autobiography of Mussolini, and that's what I'm going to be referencing today. For him, he probably would have said, "Hey, I was destined for this." As I said so many times before, with Mussolini, he was so superstitious. He believed in things like the evil eye, which is very common in Italian culture, malocchio, as we call it in Italian. But there's other superstitions. Now, are these superstitions of pagan origin? Probably most likely, and I don't think they're of Catholic origin, for sure. But the fact is that these superstitions, I think there always was a streak of pagan culture that to a certain degree ran through Italy, even despite its deep Catholic roots. Italy wasn't as stable as other nations. That's why Italy was late sort of to the game of things like colonialization and building a stable society or empire. But once it did, um, you know, it actually happened under Mussolini, to be honest, for the most part, as Italy was an unstable country. And so, how these regions communicated with each other, how traditions developed, how the faith spread, there could be nuance in all of this. But, when we look at Mussolini and his destiny, it's interesting. In her autobiography here, which was published in 1974, remember, at this point, Raquel Mussolini is in her 80s. She's in the last days of her life. I think she died a few years after that. She's writing this book 29 years after the death of El Duce, and she's kind of getting things off her chest as the way, at least the way she saw them. And it's very important to me because it comes from the inner circle. Now, many critics are going to say, well, wait a minute. Raquel was biased. It was his wife. She's protecting his legacy. Well, read the book for yourself, right? She has her critiques of Mussolini, but in many ways, what she says is profound, but really no different than a lot of the other historical confirmations we've got about Mussolini, in the sense that he was a very well balanced character, clearly had his flaws, clearly made his mistakes, but the sort of the predetermined sort of liberal notion that we have in the West that he was some kind of a monster akin to the failed Austrian painter, that reputation just doesn't hold water throughout history. It just doesn't. And Raquel confirms it. So listen, for all the naysayers and all the critics, I would acknowledge, right, when you're reading a book by a wife of a dictator, that there could be a bias, without a doubt. But in the sincerity that I at least see in this book, we have to consider it, what she said. Granted, again, we'll keep in the back of our mind that there could be a bias here. But it's fascinating because in the very opening chapter of the book, it's actually titled Mussolini and Destiny. Now, guys, let me put my glasses on here. I want to read to you a section here. This is fascinating to me. Okay, as we get into the man of who Mussolini was, and who else to get it from than his closest confidant, his own wife, who knew him the best. You know, Mussolini always confided in Rochelle. Mussolini always saw Rochelle as his greatest ally, and she was the first one to always protect him, especially from his own inner circle. Remember when the Grand Fascist Council turned on Mussolini, voted against him, gave him a vote of no confidence that gave the king the legal authority to overthrow him as the prime minister of Italy. It was actually Rochelle. I don't know if it's Raquel or Rochelle. Okay, so I go back and forth on that, but it was Rochelle that initially said, "Listen, all those traitors, have them all lined up and shot," because she knew the significance of what they had done. They had betrayed not only Mussolini himself, but they betrayed Italy in many ways. That's in the middle of a war to have this regime change. And in many ways, you could argue from a historical perspective, a military perspective, she was right. Unfortunately for Mussolini, well, I don't want to say unfortunately, I don't want to put moral judgments on this, but for Mussolini, Mussolini never, even the people that backstabbed him, he never turned on them. That's the interesting thing about him. Um, And so for him, he while he admitted he had no close friends, the inner circle, the associates that he worked with when he was the Italian prime minister, he never threw anybody under the bus. He always took everybody at sort of face value and tried to find, the best out of people, right? But his wife saw it a different way. His wife was more readily astute, I guess you could say, to read through what people were actually doing. Well, Benito was always looking for, again, the best that you could find from an individual, understanding that everybody is flawed. But in chapter one of her book, fascinating, I want to read you a section about destiny and Benito's destiny, because it really could have changed in so many ways. And it's a conversation actually she records that took place in May of 1936. And where Italy is at that point. Remember, the war, World War II, Italy's entrance in that really doesn't start till what? 1940, I believe, right around there. And things begin to deteriorate after Italy goes into Greece and has problems in Greece and things of that nature. Um, but by 1936, before this conversation takes place, Mussolini's destiny was one of a much more positive note than how it ended. By 1936, he had been now the leader of Italy for 13 years, let's call it 13 and a half years. He had taken Italy from being a backwards nation, a nation that was kind of looked upon, as sort of I don't want to say a third world nation, but something akin to that. It wasn't very well respected. It was a nation full of political corruption through the democratic process. Um, most of your workforce, well, was out of work. It was a heavy agricultural fishing nation. There wasn't a whole lot of industry. The corruption and the confusion, even that a lot of socialist movements caused, had made the economy very stagnant, backward ass. It was in major national debt in order to try and keep up with some of the sort of the big issues that nations were trying to deal with at the time. You had a culture that was divided, particularly um, by by regions, right? Because Italians were always kind of, it was this nation that was kind of in a way artificially put together. They had different cultures, different customs, different regions, all splintered apart. They had, Italy as a nation going through its Risorgimento, its revolution, had, sort of enslaved the Pope and the Papal States, taking the power away from the Pope. Thus, the government creating a big confliction between the hegemonous Catholic faith in that region of the world versus the new secular politics, leftist politics, post French Revolution that is now sweeping all of Europe, but in this case, particularly Italy. And so there's loyalties divided. Most people don't even understand, really know what an Italian really is, since everybody identifies by local regions. Remember, the idea of Catholic subsidiarity really is what dominated that part of the world, right? We would call that local government subsidiarity. And every region had its own customs, own traditions, own history, own foods, own languages, own dialects in many ways. And so when this this unification happens in many ways, I don't know how organic it really is. In some ways, it's it's really artificial. And it was Mussolini that kind of put this thing, well, really Italian fascism, that really put this thing together at the end of the day. And through that, he answered the big question in Italy that nobody could ever answer or figure out a problem that every political leader failed before Mussolini, and that is the question Romana, the question of the church, because Italy was Catholic. It was that simple. It was culturally, religiously Catholic. And it was Mussolini through the Lateran Accords that unified the church and the state, making Italy an integralist Catholic nation. You had an economy that was now starting to boom in Italy. Think what you want of corporatism. Italy was doing better in terms of economics. It started to solve some of the problems of sort of the day labor issues where you had lots of men that were out of work. And they started to kind of deal with a lot of the oligarchical sort of aristocrat landowners that dominated most of the land, that left most of the people out in the cold. They started to deal with that. It wasn't perfect, but they started to deal with it. It was a nation under Mussolini that did not run a lot of debt. Mussolini did not believe in enslaving Italy and its people to international financiers. Um, by the 1930s, they solved a lot of their problems. They had a problem of grains, and Mussolini put his sleeves up. This is why oftentimes you see Mussolini out there with his shirt off, working the fields. They kind of laughed about it, her and Raquel, because he took his. Wait a minute. While he never took a government pay, when Mussolini in the early 30s went out into the field to lead by example, to work the field, he took his peasant pay of, I think it was 3 liras per day, and he brought it home, and they kind of laughed about it because Mussolini, again, never took a government pay. He kind of lived off his little newspaper, Popolo d'Italia. Remember, his wife bitterly complained how even, while Mussolini is the head of state and one of the biggest leaders in the world, her household is run kind of inefficiently because the money isn't there for them to run it. They lived very modest lives in very modest homes, but when Mussolini went to the fields to work the fields as the prime minister to lead by example, he took his three lira pay and brought it home, and they kind of laughed about it. But kind of a thing that's just what the field workers paid at the time. Um, and he had all kinds of other issues. Foreign policy wise, Mussolini in Italy became very well respected under Mussolini. Remember, there was a big fascination, even in America over Mussolini. Because remember, the Great Depression hit in the early 1920s. And Italy was not hit as hard by, say, a nation like America. Um, a lot of it, I think, is because it was highly agricultural. It was a big fishing industry, but they didn't have the ties to the banks. It wasn't, they didn't have the same kind of ties to Wall Street as, say, a more industrialized nation like America. They used usury and high finance in order to run their economy. By 1936, the Ethiopian War was just about over. Remember, Italy goes into Ethiopia in 35. By 36, it's pretty much over at that point. And all of a sudden now, not only has Mussolini taken a backward nation politically, culturally, and religiously and fixed most of those problems, but now Mussolini was starting to create an Italian empire. Granted, Ethiopia was kind of, at the bottom of the rung because Italy was always late to the party when it came to colonization. And I have a video I did on Ethiopia, or as they call it back then, Abyssinia, and the details of that and how all that went down. But now all of a sudden Mussolini is creating this empire. Remember, Mussolini always believed that Italy needed to expand its population in order to compete with the United States, the British and the French, who were stronger empires at the time. And so he created a nation of strong moral prudence, one that was going to produce the population or increase the population size. He had banned abortion, he had banned contraception, he had put all the crucifixes back in the classrooms, in the orphanages, in the hospitals, everything like that through the Lateran Accords, and really restored the glory of the church in many ways at the same time. And so there's many great accomplishments here. Again, economic viability and simply giving Italians an identity for the first time since really the 1870 revolution. And that's important to remember. And his status worldwide had increased. And in many ways, this is why when the problems in Europe preceding or leading up to World War II were going down, it was the Western leaders that always went to Mussolini to try and solve these problems. And in many ways, he did, at least as much as he could, right? Especially at the Stresa conference and at Munich, right? Trying to stop World War II. Mussolini stopped World War II twice. It was always the British and the Americans going to Mussolini as sort of that in between Hitler and the Western powers to try and fend off or stop or delay or whatever negotiating tactic they needed at that moment. It was always Mussolini that was the guy in the middle there that stopped this. But of course, as we know, there was a breaking point between Mussolini and the British. We've covered that before, and we'll leave that for another time again here. But I guess Italy is really in a prominent position by 1936. Mussolini is in a prominent position. The question is again, when it comes to destiny, Mussolini and destiny, what's left for him at that point? 14 years of his reign. What is the succession process in Italy in regards to a fascist nation? I don't know. I don't think the succession process in fascism has ever really been defined. Maybe there is. I'm not sure. But in case of Mussolini, who's the dictator at the time, um, I'm not quite sure. I mean, obviously, it probably would have gone back down to the king. It was the king that appointed Mussolini as the head of state in 1922. If Mussolini would step down, it will go back to the king. Mussolini always respected the authority of the king, and then it's the prerogative of the king. And finally, I think the most important thing too is Mussolini had beat back communism and socialism, which was the original purpose of his ascendancy into power, as Italy was being overrun by far leftists and Marxists and Bolsheviks. And so, really, that's where we're at in 1936. And then this conversation takes place. Let me read this to you. It's not very long. And this is Rochelle writing. Remember Napoleon, Benito, since you admire him so true, he was powerful. He mastered Europe and even ruled countries farther afield. But what did he really do? As soon as he won one victory, he looked for more. After each conquest, he still wanted a bigger empire. And what happened to him, Benito? He lost the lot. Everything crumbled under his feet. Don't be like him. Remember that song we sang when we were children? Napoleon, with all his superb, wound up on Elba. What do you want me to do? Resign? Raise chickens in Romagna? You must be joking, Rochelle. No, no, I don't want you to raise chickens in Romagna. I want you to stop in time to become part of history while you're still alive, to devote 10 or 15 years of your life to your wife and children after giving 30 to politics. Political life is too dirty to be good all the time. So far, you've been lucky. You've known only the good times. But watch out from now on. The conversation occurred in May 1936 when my husband, Benito Mussolini, and I were staying at the Rocca del Caminata, our home in Romagna. A few days earlier, Benito had stood on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia to to an ecstatic crowd the creation of the empire after the Ethiopian conquest. Now we were alone, and nobody heard me entreating him to abandon power. On the surface, there was nothing to warrant such a step. At the time, Benito, who was not yet 53, he was born on July 29th, 1883, was in a perfect health. And in a political sense, he had never been so strong either in Italy or abroad. Our armies had crushed Ethiopians completely. The lira flourished as one of Europe's most stable currencies, and the League of Nations sanctions imposed on Italy after the Ethiopian adventure have failed. With patriotic fervor, the Italian people had themselves helped thwart the sanctions by giving their gold to the government. In Rome, for instance, they cast their welding rings into a brazier on the marble base of the tomb of the unknown soldier. And in 1935, numerous Italians living in the United States had ingeniously sent tons of copper that Italy so badly needed, inventing a special copper postcard engraved with Christmas greetings. Even such prominent opponents of Benito as philosopher Benedetto Croce and former Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando had recently acted with my husband, whom foreign powers were hailing as a realist, influential, and wise. There were no black clouds to darken the horizon, yet I could not resist the urge to persuade my husband to quit the political scene. My desire, doubtless, fostered by my marvelous weather that enhanced our family holiday at Rocco della Caminata. Two of our children, Victorio and Bruno, who were pilots, had just returned safely from combat in Ethiopia, and were especially happy to have them with us again. I seized my chance one afternoon after a long drive through the Romagnol countryside. Soon after lunch, unescorted by secretary, prefect, or security police, we'd gone out alone in our Alfa Romero Spider. Benito was wearing a beret pulled low over his forehead, and I had scarf knotted under my chin, and we were enjoying ourselves like 20-year-olds. We stopped several times at peasant houses, as it was Benito's habit in Romagna, and as always happened, the first few moments of surprise and emotion, Benito and the locals began chatting about the crop, the cows, the house, and the children. To the people of Romagna, he was still Muslim, the son of Alessandro, the blacksmith. I had to tug on his sleeve to remind him of the time. So for a moment, he was alone with me in the garden, splitting logs with the sleeves rolled up, while I poked about in a bed of roses. Occasionally, I glanced at him, and seeing him with his tan skin, a hint of gentleness in his mature expression, I could almost understand why women fell on his neck and on his feet or into the sea when he went bathing. Once he had chopped the logs, Benito called, "You know what the king suggested the other day? He wanted to make me a prince." "I hope you didn't accept," she responded. "Are you joking? Can you see me arriving somewhere with the usher announcing His Excellency Prince Mussolini, and I be Princess Rochelle? Lord, what an idea." "Don't worry," I kept a straight face. Though the thought of my head beneath a crown made me want to laugh out loud. And I answered, Majesty, I'm touched by this gesture, but I cannot accept. I was born Mussolini, and I'll die Mussolini without title. What did the king say? Rochelle responded. You could at least take a dukedom. Again, I refuse. Then, pretending to look upset, Benito added, You won't be Princess Mussolini or Duchess of Rocca della Caminata. You'll stay Rochelle Mussolini. And we began to laugh, and I could scarcely believe the story and had to make Benito swear it was true. Okay. And so I'll stop there. So this is where Mussolini's at this point in time. He's had everything. And his wife is urging him to retire in 1936. What's more left to accomplish? And you can understand why. He has a family, 5 kids, couple of boys. The analogy of Napoleon is interesting. And I know this is something I struggle with in many ways in life, and that is you have everything in life, or you have a lot of good things in life, and you're always pushing and pushing more, right? We see that in American culture oftentimes with people that pursue careers or the material world or money or whatever it may be. How much was Mussolini going to pursue? Would he ever spend or devote any time to his family? Which we know he loved his family very much. And in many ways, Rochelle, for her part, wanted her husband home. Understandable, especially after he'd given so much 30 years into politics. And she's basically telling him, listen, don't push it. You've had a great run here for 14 years. Maybe it's time to pack it up, come home, forget about it. Just move on with your life. You've made Italy a great nation. What more is there left? Well, of course, as the story goes on, as Raquel explains, she says, well, Mussolini entertained the idea. Mussolini thought about the idea. Effectively, that's what he responded to her. I'll think about it. And that's why I say when we talk about destiny, what is destiny? I know in life, you know, we all look at the end conclusion of something and say, okay, that was destiny. But really, as creatures that have the God-given free will to make choices and decisions, the choices we make oftentimes determine our destiny. I know I've lived a life of choices, many good, many bad, and it's something we all have to live with. And it was this moment in time where Benito was considering possibly, at the request of his wife, at the request of his family, that maybe it's time to pack it up. Now, the question, of course, is if Mussolini would have packed it up in 1936 and really considered Rochelle's request, would he be known as the kind of figure that he is today? Because at the end of the day, right, he does become from a more, simplistic version of history, that notorious character that joined the Austrian, the failed Austrian painter, and we have to consider that, right? Would he have just been another leader forgotten about for, in many ways, being dull? I don't know. I don't know, because fascism in and of itself was a different entity. Maybe fascism itself that was founded in Italy, maybe that in itself would have been his legacy, and maybe we would have known about Benito. But definitely World War II is what really enamors people to put this historical character in this certain historical context that we've all come to know, and why his name is so widely known today, whether it's for good or for bad. And so he thought about it. Rochelle goes on to talk about in the book is the problem was that his inner circle wasn't ready for Benito to be done. And she even admits that they put up many, many arguments of why he shouldn't resign, that his time in power wasn't over. There was a lot more for him to consider. Even though she herself admits she was being selfish, she wanted Benito at home. One of the arguments, it's fascinating to me, that his inner circle put up why he should not retire, why he should not consider resigning, was the war in Spain. Remember, Stalin was sending troops into Spain to conquer Western Europe. Mussolini had already been sending troops to help Franco, which is fascinating, which complicated things. You resign in the middle of a war, especially when Benito understood the nature of Marxism, communism. He had driven it out of Italy. Remember what Benito said? And this is when the British got caught with their tail between their legs. They didn't know what to do with it, right? Because to them, they felt they were between a rock and a hard place, between fascism and communism. They couldn't differentiate between the two. And that is, they didn't know what to do in Spain. The French joined uh, the Republic side, joined Stalin in assisting Stalin in Spain because they already had an allegiance. They already had a pact, a treaty with the Soviets going back to the 1920s. And of course, for the French, a nation full of communists, socialists, Freemasons, and radicals, it was natural for the French to ally themselves with the Soviets. But for Benito and those of the Christian world, they had real concerns about what was going on in Spain. And she doesn't go deeper in details about the other reasons why his inner circle was concerned and alarmed over him considering resigning at that point. But definitely, the Spanish Civil War was one of them. As Benito always said, we cannot have the flag of the sickle and hammer flying in Western Europe. You cannot have a communist Soviet satellite nation to your, well, for Italy, that would be what? The left flank, the north flank, right there in Europe. The last thing they want to deal with. And this is ultimately why you get this alliance between Franco, Mussolini, and eventually Hitler as well, too. But he had to see the Spanish Civil War through. But let's stop and speculate, I guess, for a moment in regards to his destiny. What if, right? What if? And I get it. What if can be a dangerous game historically because it's all speculation. But what if Mussolini would have considered it? Maybe appointed a subordinate to see through the Spanish Civil War that Italy was now involved in. What if Mussolini would have resigned in 1936? Would Italy have gotten involved in World War II? Because clearly the relationship that develops between Germany and Italy is one of leaders, right? The Italians and the Germans never liked each other. They're different people, different customs, tradition. Italy being homogeneously Catholic, Germany being 50-50, right? 50% Protestant, 50% Catholic. Obviously, there's some commonalities between the two nations. But remember, after World War I, Italy had turned on sort of Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire fought with the Allied side. The Germans never forgot that, felt betrayed by the Italians. So there was no love lost. This is why after Mussolini is deposed and the Civil War breaks out in Italy, northern Italy, during the time of Mussolini's reign of the Republic of Salo, the Germans were excessively brutal against the Italian population. So the question here is, does Italy stay out of World War II, if not of the personalities? I don't know. We don't know. It would, in many ways, it would have been dependent on who the king appointed. But historically, it's fascinating to understand and see. But Mussolini's legacy at that point would have been he restored Italy to her glory. He repaired the relationship with church and state, made Italy a Catholic integralist nation, fiscally responsible, kept out the international bankers. Many great things that Italy had become. He was at the top of his game. But he was drawn deeper and deeper into that war in Spain, and eventually, of course, would come World War II. And that would be Mussolini's fatal error, not being to keep Italy out of that war. Fatal error for Italy and fatal error for himself. So this is all speculation at this part. I think it's fascinating because Raquel, I think, here is pointing out that history could have gone different, especially as the wife, as the closest confidant, as somebody that truly cared about him. But it's interesting at the end of this chapter. Well, she goes on to talk about Victorio, the son of Mussolini, coming to America, being invited to the White House, having a conversation with Franklin Roosevelt. He was invited there. Roosevelt made a request to Victorio to ask his father if they would meet sometime, if they could meet even on neutral territory or something that effect, because Roosevelt was desperate to keep Italy out of the alliance with Germany. But um, according to Rochelle here, it was already too late. Um, the British had pushed Mussolini too far away and into Hitler's camp, even though he desperately tried to stay out of that alliance. And also, Franklin Roosevelt didn't help either, as they put an embargo on Italy, forcing Mussolini to go to Germany for natural resources. So she touches on that in this chapter. But at the end, again, when we talk about destiny, let me see here. Let me see here. This is very important here. Okay. What could have been? Because the sad tragedy of Mussolini is his death in many ways. And I'm going to do a show on that, his final moments in life. And I think I've kind of touched on it when he was obviously captured by the partisans, shot on the side of the road with his mistress. And if you know the man personally, intimately, it becomes a sad story. For our Western sensibilities and our caricatures we make of everybody that doesn't agree with our democratic values, yeah, we don't care. We just whatever, you know, he got what he deserved, kind of a thing. But with me, I look deeper into nuance, and I find Mussolini a very interesting character. But this is what she writes in the same chapter at the very end here, right? Years after the war, Victorio told me that he had worked out a plan that was complete save for one detail, his father's consent. On April 25th, Victorio outlined a plan to Air Marshal Bonami that involved flying my husband to Spain. Bonami confirmed that some three-engine planes were ready to leave near Brescia and guaranteed to get Benito to Spain, provided he left quickly. Remember, the idea was get him to Spain. Franco would protect Mussolini after Mussolini had saved Spain, right? That same day, Benito was in Milan, now in control of the prefecture. He had convened a succession of meetings to decide on future action. When Victorio arrived at my husband's office in the morning, he found his father alone outside the yard and corridor, seated with nervous activity. Everybody searched madly for some solution to the insoluble problem of Italy's confusion at the end of the World War. Benito asked Vittorio what he wanted, and my son, fearing a sudden interruption, quickly described his plan. He said that once safe in Spain, Benito could negotiate with the Allies and thus help Italy in her terrible dilemma. In fact, Vittorio tried every means to persuade my husband, as I had done when I appealed to him to resign in the in his hour of glory. Benito listened, not reacting at all until Vittorio had finished. Then, smiling and pointing to the door through which he came, excited chatter, he asked, "You think that's the right solution? Fine. And have you a plane for all those fascists outside and the fascists in the north?" He asked. To serve Italy, he had remained in office for 9 years earlier. Now, true to himself, he thought it is his duty to stay with his followers in the fatal hour. I think he considered his attitude not heroic, but simply logical. So even there, at the very end, at the last hours, when the war is going bad, remember what Mussolini said? He was never going to be taken alive. He was not going to be put up on show trials in London or New York. That's what he feared the most. And that's why when the caravan going up towards Switzerland, many people thought that he was going to find a town, him and the last of the fascist followers that were all being hunted down by the communist partisans, and make a last stand and die there. He understood his faith. He understood his destiny at that point. But he had a chance to change that destiny, apparently a plan to get him out of the country, and he refused. Michelle says he wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to be logical. But in many ways, the man that's the creator of the fascist movement, in many ways, would have had to live with himself if he abandoned all the fellow fascists because they were all being hunted down by communists, taking their vengeance out. I think Rochelle is probably being kind of, how do you want to call it here? Humble about what Mussolini might have been thinking. But clearly, in a day and age of liberal narcissism, where we have a society where everybody thinks for number one in our current cultures, had to be something a little bit heroic, but not abandoning the ship, being the captain of that ship, not abandoning it, and going down with the rest of the crew. Maybe there is a little bit of heroism there. And that's kind of my perspective. I'll extrapolate that out if Raquel doesn't want to say that. But Mussolini's destiny could have been changed at any time. He could have resigned in 1936. He could have fled the country in the darkest hours of the war when it was all falling apart. And he didn't. His destiny was determined by his choices. I always believe we have choices. I'm not sure anything is really predetermined unless it's of God's will, obviously. And even that, we know God gives us free will. But just like we all have the free choice to accept the grace of God or to reject the grace of God, in many ways, life is about that. I think with Mussolini, he probably had good reasons to stay in power. And in the end, he had also had good reasons to flee. But he chose not to. He chose to live a life of honor, at least from his perspective, an honor that we probably won't ever get too much in the West. I understand that, but that's who he was. He rejected money. He rejected titles. He truly was an idealist in the sense that he loved Italy. That's what he always tried to do. At least that's how I've read history. And I know there's going to be detractors out there that dispute that point. But from everything I've ever read about the man, it was not about power per se. Now, obviously, listen, I'm not going to discount the power thing completely. I think we all have a sense of, or a belief that we could want to do good, or at least what is right and just in our own eyes. But he rejected the material world. He rejected the title for title's sake. And at the end of the day, he was a simple man that cared for country and family and had a conversion back to his faith. Faith, family, nation. Faith, family, nation. Which was really the fascist model in many ways. It's what it was. He lived it to the very end, not even abandoning his followers, even in the face of death. A very fascinating character that I think deserves a more honest look in the eyes of history. There you have it, Mussolini's destiny. Was it destiny? Was it choices? I go with the second. I think he made his choices. And unfortunately, history played out the way it played out. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. It's Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.